That brings me, Wenchi, to maybe we can do some comparisons with Xinjiang. Any differences in the way perhaps the world understands Tibet on one side and Xinjiang on the other?
Yeah, I think, for a while, I think the issue and the attention paid to Tibet, whether it's through politicians or celebrities, did help the world understand what is really going on in Tibet. And later on, obviously, we saw more of the repression that's taking place in Xinjiang and happening to the Uyghur people. I don't, pretend to know, and I'm definitely not an expert in either part. And unfortunately, I think what China has been doing is, again, to frame some of the activities because of the repression, that resistance as terrorist attack. And so especially, I would say, for the Uyghurs, that became a very convenient excuse for them, especially after 9/11, that what we're seeing is there's this, global fear of terrorists, and a lot of them associate them with Islamists. And so we know that Uyghurs are also, believe in that Islam. And so I think, in terms of cracking down, and it just became even more convenient for the Beijing government to label them as terrorists, and so to galvanize support for their repression.
So let's cross back to Tibet, because obviously Tibet doesn't have terrorists. Tibetans practice, and Dalai Lama has always promoted non-violence. So what's the narrative there? How does it, for you, Sikyong, differ? Because there is, of course, the overarching narrative from China, which is, stabilize Tibet, stabilize Xinjiang, save them, liberate them, and then bring economic prosperity.
That's a classic colonial argument, Oh, they were feudal, they were backward, they were so poor, we made them rich, we have civilized them, so the colonies should be grateful to the colonizer, that has always, and particularly if you read Chinese history, the high school textbook, this is how they explain, 100 years of humiliation, you see. So they're doing exactly the same thing, but now victim has become victimizer. But then Tibetans, as victims, were not supposed to complain. Now, as Wenchi Yu said about Xinjiang or Uyghur region as well, it's important to know that Tibet was one of the major issues internationally in 1980s and 1990s. In recent years now, the genocide in Uyghur region, Inner Mongolia, and again the crackdown on Hong Kong, right? So when it happened, I always say this is good in the sense, before when Tibet was the only prominent issue internationally, they used to say, oh, it's an exception, Tibetans an exception. Now there's a pattern, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongolians, Hong Kongers, and then increasingly, pressure and intimidation on Taiwan clearly show that we are dealing with the regime. We are dealing with a systematic strategy on the part of Beijing to, expand its region. So, I've met many people who said, oh, China is a very peaceful country. They have not done anything violent for the last 300 years. But said, no, look at Tibet, look at Hong Kong, look at Xinjiang, and hopefully, I hope not, but, increasing threat towards Hong Kong. So we are dealing with the regime.
Can I bring you now to Mao Zedong's strategy, which is the 5 fingers and palm strategy? So this was, announced in 1939. Obviously, Tibet was annexed in 1950, 1951. So the idea was that following the annexation of Tibet, then there would be 5 fingers that would come in later stages: Ladakh, Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, and Arunachal Pradesh. How much of Mao's strategy do you see Xi Jinping continuing?
I'm glad you brought this up because, this code was there for a long time. And when the Doklam, incident happened
2017.
Between, 17 between India and from Chinese side, and then in 2020 in Galwan Valley in Ladakh, right?
Yeah.
So I appeared in major TV news media, so I made it quite, well known. So Mao Zedong has said since, for ages, saying Tibet is the palm, we must occupy it, then go after 5 fingers. So Galwan Valley is in Ladakh. Doklam, borders Bhutan and Sikkim, and the chicken neck of India. And then there's always conflicts and tension in Arunachal Pradesh. So, and then recently, New York Times in August came out with this, huge expose of more than 300 border villages are being built all the way from Karakoram, from Tibet all the way to Myanmar, right? So the intrusion into, all the neighboring countries of Nepal, Bhutan, and India, it's happening. So what Mao Zedong said is being implemented now.
Right, and Wenchi, but it's not through fighting. It's not through kinetic war or violence. Now, I mean, Tibet was, but these appear not to be. So this kind of winning without a fight strategy, how do we explain that change? Can you explain the shift that's occurred?
Well, there's definitely security forces stabilizing in those regions, even though it's not technically defined as fighting, right? Skirmishes on the borders with India and crackdown.
Not non-firearms, though.
Right, right. One thing that's really interesting about the way Beijing approaches those territories is that the economic prosperity that they try to introduce to the region as a way to integrate the locals and the Han people or the Chinese culture. We've seen that being played out everywhere. And so from Tibet to Xinjiang and even Hong Kong today, and what Beijing tried with Taiwan, right? Increasing economic and trade relationship, but that's always been the approach. And if I'm not wrong, I think one of the most senior officials,
the party secretary of Tibet, yes.
Right, party secretary. So, I mean, essentially they're replicating what they're doing in those areas. And what we're seeing in Hong Kong these days, especially like if you go to Hong Kong today, the language spoken there rather than Cantonese is more Chinese, and in their education system, right, introducing and ensuring the Chinese identity is there. I mean, these are years of campaign and very thought out plan to make sure that the identity of China is instilled in every one of them. So, and of course, economic prosperity is something that they know is very powerful. And they use that around the world as well, right? Economic power and leverage that they've had. So this is, something very strategic and very thoughtful, and they have a lot of patience to do that.
Acting around the world, I always say this, if you want to understand China, you must understand Tibet. If you don't understand Tibet, you will never understand China. Because the blueprint of the United Front approaches, co-optation, intimidation, all that took place in Tibet, and it's taking place around the world, So that's why, what's happening in Hong Kong, first they send United Front, right? So that's why winning without fighting. And I'm sure it's happening in Taiwan as well, and it's happening around the world. So one should be very careful. Because I was giving a talk somewhere in South India, and there were 2 African students, they raised their hands and asked me a question. Before they asked me a question, I said, oh, so are they building good roads, and are they building good entertainment center, and are they, are they friendly with your leaders? I said, how do you know about my country? I said, that happened to Tibet. 60 years ago, I can tell you, this is exact same blueprint, So co-optation or buying off of politicians, business people, news media, and intellectuals. This is a classic strategy. It goes all the way back 2,000-3,000 years when China first, started building up. So one should be very, very careful.